The storm breaks, but our resolve hold firm. Fifth on top. The storm breaks, but our resolve hold firm. Fifth on top. The time for silence is over. We rise now. Justice. No turn them back at. The storm outblast. Stand firm and bros. Raise you to our side. Fight and calls.
Denmark Vesey's story begins far from Charleston, long before whispers of rebellion filled the humid night air of South Carolina. He was born around 1767 in the Caribbean, likely on the island of St. Thomas. His original name is believed to have been Telemaque. As a boy, he was captured and sold into slavery. His childhood was not filled with games or lessons in comfort. It was shaped by transactions by ships and by the constant movement of a system that treated human beings as cargo. He was eventually purchased by a slave trader named Joseph Vesey, a man who traveled often between the Caribbean and Charleston. Denmark, as he later became known, moved through ports and cities at a young age. He saw ships dock and depart. He heard multiple languages spoken across marketplaces. He watched wealth flow through hands that never had to lift heavy loads. Even in chains, he observed the world carefully. For years he labored as an enslaved man in Charleston. The city was one of the busiest slave ports in the United States. The streets were lined with elegant homes built on the profits of rice, indigo, and cotton. Behind those homes were quarters where enslaved people slept in cramped conditions. The contrast between wealth and suffering was sharp. Denmark saw it every day. But something about him stood out. He was intelligent, disciplined, and observant. He learned to read and write, a skill that many enslaved people were violently denied. Literacy opened a door in his mind. It allowed him to study scripture and to examine ideas of freedom and justice. The Bible, particularly stories of deliverance, spoke deeply to him. The story of the Israelites escaping bondage in Egypt did not feel distant. It felt personal. In 1799, Denmark's life took a dramatic turn. He purchased a lottery ticket. Against overwhelming odds, he won a significant prize. With those winnings, he bought his freedom for about $600. The moment must have felt unreal. After decades in bondage, he was legally free. He took the name Denmark Vesey, adopting the surname of the man who had once owned him. Freedom did not erase memory. He walked through Charleston as a free black man in a city built on slavery. He could move more freely than before, but he could not ignore what he saw. Families still torn apart, overseers still brutal, children still born into chains. His own freedom did not extend to his wife or children, who remained enslaved. That reality cut deeply. Denmark became a skilled carpenter. He built furniture and earned steady income. Over time, he accumulated modest wealth. He joined the African Methodist Episcopal Church, one of the first independent black churches in the United States. The church was more than a place of worship. It was a place where black people gathered, spoke openly, and dreamed quietly. Within its walls, faith and resistance blended. As the years passed, Denmark's thoughts turned from personal freedom to collective liberation. He read scripture that spoke of justice. He listened to stories of revolution in Haiti, where enslaved people had successfully overthrown colonial rule. The Haitian Revolution shook slave-holding societies across the Americas. It proved that enslaved people could organize, fight, and win. That example lingered in Denmark's mind. Charleston in the early 1820s was tense. The city's population included a large number of enslaved Africans and free black residents. White leaders feared uprising constantly. Laws grew stricter. Black gatherings were monitored. But fear also revealed something important. It revealed that the system was not as stable as it appeared. Denmark began to speak quietly with trusted men. He did not shout his plans in public. He moved carefully, recruiting those he believed were disciplined and committed. The plan was bold. It involved seizing weapons, setting fires as distractions, and eventually escaping by ship to Haiti. The goal was not random violence. It was liberation. Meetings were held in secret. Conversations were coded. Trust was everything. Denmark understood the risk. Discovery would mean death. Yet he believed the risk of doing nothing was worse. Each day that passed meant another child born into slavery, another family broken, Another lash delivered. Reports later suggested that thousands of enslaved people may have been aware of the plan. If true, it would have been one of the largest organized slave revolts in American history. The chosen date for the uprising was set for July in 1822. Weapons were to be gathered, signals coordinated, ships prepared, but secrecy is fragile. Someone spoke. Whether out of fear, loyalty to enslavers, or hope of reward, informants revealed details of the plot. White authorities acted quickly. Arrests began before the planned date. Interrogations were harsh. Fear spread through Charleston like wildfire. Denmark Vesey was arrested and accused of being the mastermind. He did not publicly confess in the way authorities demanded. Court proceedings were secretive and biased. The outcome had already been decided. In July of 1822, Denmark Vesey and several alleged co-conspirators were sentenced to death. He was hanged in Charleston. He was around 55 years old. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. The revolt never happened. The ships to Haiti never sailed. The fires never lit the sky. But the fear his plan created left a permanent mark. White leaders responded by tightening slave codes even further. They shut down the African Methodist Episcopal Church. They increased surveillance. The reaction revealed how seriously they had taken the threat. Denmark Vesey's story did not end at the gallows. For decades, his name was spoken in whispers. Some called him a dangerous rebel. Others called him a visionary. His life forces uncomfortable questions. What does freedom mean if it is only for one person? What is the moral weight of planning revolt in a system built on violence? He had purchased his own freedom. He could have lived quietly, protecting his business and avoiding risk. Instead, he chose to imagine freedom for many. That choice required extraordinary courage. It also required willingness to sacrifice everything. When we humanize him, we must imagine the nights he lay awake weighing his decision, the faces of his enslaved children, the risk of betrayal, the possibility of success. He was not reckless. He was deliberate. He believed deeply that bondage was wrong, not only spiritually but morally and politically. His story remains one of the most controversial and powerful episodes in early American history. It reveals the constant tension beneath the surface of slaveholding societies. It reminds us that enslaved and free black people were not passive observers of their condition. They debated, organized, and dreamed of liberation. Denmark Vesey walked through Charleston as a free man, but his mind refused to accept a world where others remained chained. His plan did not unfold as intended, yet the fact that it existed at all challenges a narrative that slavery was stable or uncontested. Today, his name stands as a symbol of resistance, not because the revolt succeeded, but because he dared to envision it. He saw beyond his individual circumstance. He believed in collective freedom. And even though his life ended in execution, the question he raised still echoes. What would justice require in a world built on injustice? After Denmark Vesey was executed in July of 1822, Charleston did not return to normal. The city tried to convince itself that the danger had been eliminated, that the hanging of one man and dozens of others had restored order. But fear lingered. It settled into the streets, into the conversations of slaveholders, into the laws passed afterward. The reaction revealed something powerful. The system was afraid. White authorities in Charleston did not treat the conspiracy as a small matter. They believed it had spread widely among enslaved communities. They believed hundreds, possibly thousands, had at least heard whispers of the plan. Whether every detail was accurate or exaggerated, the fear was real. That fear changed policy. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, where Denmark Vesey had worshipped and organized, was shut down. Black gatherings were restricted. Patrols increased. Laws were tightened to prevent enslaved people from learning to read or assembling freely. The white leaders of Charleston did not simply punish individuals. They tried to suffocate the ideas that had inspired them. And that is where Denmark Vesey's legacy becomes larger than the revolt itself. He understood something many enslavers refused to admit. Slavery was not stable. It rested on force and fear. If enslaved people organized in large numbers, the entire structure could shake. The fact that he came so close to launching one of the largest uprisings in United States history terrified the city. But beyond the fear and repression lies the human side of his story. Denmark Vesey was not born a rebel. He was born into bondage. He purchased his freedom through luck and persistence. He built a life as a carpenter. He joined a church community. He could have chosen comfort over confrontation. He could have protected his income and avoided risk. Yet every time he walked through Charleston, he saw men and women who did not share his legal freedom. He saw families separated at auctions. He saw children growing up in chains. And he had his own family still enslaved. Freedom tasted incomplete when those closest to him remained captive. That contradiction likely grew heavier with each passing year. His reading of Scripture influenced him deeply. Stories of liberation shaped his thinking. The idea that oppression was not ordained but challenged in sacred texts gave him moral framework. He did not see revolt as chaos. He saw it as deliverance. In his mind, the system was already violent. Planning resistance was a response, not an initiation. We must imagine the quiet meetings he held with trusted men, the low voices, the careful choice of words, the constant awareness that betrayal could come at any moment. Trust was fragile. Loyalty was tested. Every conversation carried risk. That atmosphere required discipline. The plan itself was ambitious. It involved coordinated action across plantations and city districts. It required weapons. It required timing. It required unity among people who had been deliberately divided by a system designed to prevent solidarity. That level of organization speaks to leadership skill. Denmark Vesey was not acting impulsively. He was strategizing. When betrayal came, it must have felt crushing to know that someone had spoken to authorities, to hear footsteps approaching not as allies, but as arresting officers. In those final days before execution, he would have faced intense interrogation. Authorities sought names. They sought confessions. They sought reassurance that the threat was contained. Records suggest he maintained composure. He did not publicly renounce his beliefs to save himself. He faced execution, knowing the consequences. That acceptance does not make the ending less tragic, but it reveals conviction. His execution was meant to send a message. It was meant to warn others that resistance would be met with death. Yet history shows that such messages rarely end the desire for freedom. They often deepen it. For decades after his death, Denmark Vesey's name remained controversial. Some historians question the scale of the plot. Some argued that authorities exaggerated it to justify repression. Others pointed to testimony suggesting conspiracy was indeed vast. The debates continue. But regardless of the exact numbers involved, one fact remains undeniable. The fear among slaveholders was profound. That fear speaks volumes. Systems that are confident in their moral legitimacy do not panic at whispers. They do not rush to silence churches and tighten laws. The reaction to Vesey's plan revealed insecurity beneath the surface of slave society. Today, Denmark Vesey is remembered in Charleston with memorials and plaques. His name has been reclaimed by many as a symbol of courage. But remembering him requires honesty about complexity. He planned violent revolt in a violent system. He believed freedom required force. Some see him as hero. Others struggle with the idea of uprising. Yet we cannot ignore the context. Slavery itself was daily violence. It was the buying and selling of bodies. It was the lash. It was family separation. Vesey's plan emerged from that reality. He was responding to an order that had already declared war on his humanity. When we humanize Denmark Vesey, we must see the father who could not free his own children through money alone, the husband who watched his wife remain enslaved while he walked legally free, the church member who read stories of liberation and believed they applied to his own city, the businessman who risked everything he had built for a vision larger than himself. His life forces a difficult question. What would you risk if you believed injustice was permanent unless challenged? Would you protect your own safety, or would you gamble it for possibility of collective freedom? Denmark Vesey chose the latter. His body was silenced in 1822, but the idea he carried did not die with him. It lived in whispered stories. It lived in the tightening of laws that proved fear still existed. It lived in the continued resistance of enslaved people across the South. Denmark Vesey stands as a reminder that even in the heart of a slaveholding city, there were minds envisioning liberation. not waiting passively, not accepting chains as destiny, but studying, organizing, and daring to imagine ships carrying not cargo, but free people toward new beginnings. And even after the gallows in Charleston claimed Denmark Vesey's life, the questions he raised refused to disappear. You can silence a man, but you cannot easily silence the idea that bondage is wrong. His execution was meant to crush hope. Instead, it revealed how fragile the slaveholding system truly was. Imagine the atmosphere in Charleston in the weeks after his death. Enslaved people would have heard about the arrests. They would have known that dozens were executed or exiled. Fear would have spread through quarters and fields. But beneath that fear, there may also have been something else. Awareness. Awareness that organized resistance had nearly taken shape on a massive scale. Awareness that a free black man had dared to challenge the entire structure. Denmark Vesey's plan did not emerge from chaos. It grew from years of observation and frustration. As a carpenter, he moved through different parts of the city. He saw the mechanics of wealth and power. He understood how ships moved in and out of harbor. He knew that Charleston depended on order and routine. And he also knew that enslaved people far outnumbered their enslavers in many areas. Numbers can create possibility. The Haitian Revolution remained a powerful symbol in his thinking. In Haiti, enslaved people had overthrown colonial rule and established a black republic. Slaveholding societies across the Americas were terrified of that example. Denmark Vesey saw it as proof that freedom was not fantasy. It was achievable. That belief is crucial. Once people believe something is possible, even distant possibility begins to feel like future reality. It is important to remember that he was not alone. The alleged conspiracy involved men like Gullah Jack, a spiritual leader believed to have brought African traditions into the movement. The blend of Christian scripture and African spiritual practice created a shared moral framework. Faith gave courage. Faith justified resistance. Faith told them they were not wrong to desire freedom. When the plot was exposed, the trials were conducted in secrecy. The accused were not given fair representation. Confessions were extracted under pressure. Fear influenced testimony. Justice in Charleston did not operate equally for black defendants. The outcome was predetermined. Executions were public, meant to send a warning. Yet history shows that warnings often backfire. Instead of extinguishing desire for freedom, they often sharpen it. The memory of Denmark Vesey became a quiet ember. It reminded enslaved communities that organized resistance had been imagined on a large scale. It reminded free black communities that legal freedom without collective justice remained fragile. White authorities attempted to erase him by burying him in an unmarked grave. No stone marked the place. No ceremony honored his life. But erasure does not always succeed. Stories travel through memory. They pass from generation to generation. They resurface when new movements seek inspiration. For many years, his legacy was debated. Some historians questioned the extent of the conspiracy. Others defended the scale described in trial records. But beyond the numbers lies a deeper truth. Denmark Vesey believed that slavery was morally indefensible. He believed that liberation required bold action. Whether his network included hundreds or thousands, his intention alone shook a city. We must also sit with the emotional dimension of his choice. He had purchased his own freedom. That freedom was hard-earned. It was rare. In a society where most black people were enslaved, he stood out as independent. That independence gave him a measure of safety. Choosing to risk, it meant choosing sacrifice. What drives a man to risk comfort for conflict? Perhaps it was love for his children. Perhaps it was anger at injustice. Perhaps it was conviction shaped by scripture. Perhaps it was a knowledge that freedom limited to one person is incomplete. Likely, it was all of these at once. In the quiet of night before his arrest, he may have imagined ships sailing toward Haiti filled with newly freed men and women. He may have pictured families reunited. He may have envisioned a Charleston transformed. Those dreams were bold. They were dangerous. But they were human. His life forces us to confront the tension between law and justice. The law in Charleston declared slavery legal. Vesey believed it was unjust. When law and justice clash, resistance often follows. That clash defines much of history. Today, monuments in Charleston acknowledge his name openly. What was once whispered is now engraved. That transformation shows how perspective shifts over time. A man once labeled criminal is later recognized as part of a long struggle for liberation. Denmark Vesey's story does not offer simple comfort. It is complex. It challenges us. It asks whether freedom achieved individually is enough in a world where others remain oppressed. It asks what courage looks like in the face of overwhelming power. He did not live to see emancipation. He did not witness the Civil War or the 13th Amendment, but his vision existed decades before those events. His willingness to imagine collective liberation planted a seed that later movements would carry forward. When we speak his name now, we are not glorifying violence. We are acknowledging resistance born from systemic violence. We are recognizing that enslaved and free Black people in early America were thinking politically, spiritually, and strategically about their condition. They were not passive. They were engaged in debate about their own destiny. Denmark Vesey walked through Charleston as a free man who refused to accept that freedom as sufficient. That refusal defined his legacy. Though his life ended on the gallows, his example remains a testament to the power of vision. Vision that sees beyond personal safety. Vision that imagines a city, even a nation, without chains. And in that vision, even after execution, his story continues to echo through history, reminding us that beneath systems of oppression, there are always minds preparing, always hearts daring believe that another future is possible. As time moved forward and generations changed, Denmark Vesey's name did not vanish. It lingered like a quiet storm memory in Charleston. Parents warned children about him. Ministers referenced him in sermons, sometimes cautiously. White leaders remembered him with fear. Black communities remembered him with complexity. Sometimes pride, sometimes sorrow, always awareness. For decades after 1822, Charleston tightened its grip. Black churches were monitored. Gatherings required permission. Education for enslaved people was restricted even more strictly. These actions were not random. They were responses to fear. Fear that ideas like Vesey's could grow again. Fear that literacy, faith, and unity could combine into organized resistance. Think about that carefully. A single man's plan caused an entire city to reshape its laws. That alone reveals the magnitude of his influence. Even though the revolt never happened, the possibility of it changed policy. It exposed weakness beneath confidence. It showed that numbers and coordination could threaten even the most established systems. When we imagine Denmark Vesey in his final hours, we must humanize him. He was not a symbol at that moment. He was a man facing death. He may have thought about his children. He may have prayed. He may have wondered whether his efforts would be remembered or erased. The gallows is a lonely place, but conviction can make even that place steady. His execution was meant to discourage others from dreaming of freedom. Yet history teaches us that repression often fertilizes resistance. The memory of Vesey's plan likely traveled quietly along the same networks that once carried whispers of revolt. Even enslaved people who had not participated would have heard about it. They would have known that collective action had been imagined at scale. Denmark Vesey also stands at an important crossroads in American history. His life unfolded in the decades between the American Revolution and the Civil War. The nation spoke loudly about liberty and independence, yet maintained slavery at its core. Vesey embodied that contradiction. A free Black man in a republic that praised freedom while denying it to millions. His reading of Scripture shaped his understanding of justice. The story of Exodus was not abstract theology. It was blueprint. The belief that God sided with the oppressed gave moral grounding to his actions. Faith has long fueled resistance movements. For Vesey, it offered language and purpose. It is also worth recognizing that he operated within a vibrant Black community in Charleston. Free Black artisans, church leaders, dock workers, and enslaved laborers formed networks of communication. Vesey did not invent resistance alone. He tapped into existing frustration and hope. Leadership requires followers, but also requires trust. The trust he built speaks to his reputation among peers. For years, some historians debated whether conspiracy had been exaggerated by white authorities. Fear can distort memory. Trials conducted in secrecy can warp truth, yet whether the numbers were large or modest, the fact remains that authorities believe it was serious enough to execute dozens and exile many more. That reaction is historical evidence of perceived threat. In modern times, Denmark Vesey's story has been revisited with renewed attention. Scholars examine court records. They analyze testimony. They place his plan within the broader Atlantic world of revolutions and resistance. His name now appears in textbooks, documentaries, and memorials. What was once suppressed is now studied. But beyond academic debate lies something deeper. His story challenges us emotionally. Would we have had his courage? Would we have risked everything for collective freedom? It is easy to judge from safety. Harder to imagine living in a society where violence was daily reality and options were limited. Vesey's life also complicates the image of free black existence in the early 19th century. Freedom did not equal equality. Free black people faced restrictions, suspicion, and constant vulnerability. Vesey experienced that tension firsthand. He was free on paper, but surrounded by chains. That contradiction fueled his resolve. Today, when people visit Charleston and see monuments dedicated to Vesey, they are encountering a history once buried. The city that once executed him now acknowledges him publicly. That shift reflects changing understanding. It does not undo the past, but it demonstrates that memory can evolve. Denmark Vesey's legacy is not comfortable. It is charged with moral tension. It sits at the intersection of faith and rebellion, legality and justice, personal freedom and collective liberation. But perhaps that is why his story endures. It refuses to simplify. It demands reflection. He dared to believe that slavery could be confronted directly. He dared to imagine ships not as vessels of bondage, but as pathways to Haiti and freedom. He dared to gather men under the cover of darkness and speak of uprising. He dared to risk a life he had fought hard to secure. In the end, his body was silenced, but the ideas he carried were not. They resurfaced in later resistance movements. They echoed in abolitionist campaigns. They foreshadowed the civil war that would eventually tear the nation apart over the very question he confronted. Denmark Vesey walked through Charleston as a free man who refused to be satisfied with partial justice. That refusal defines him. It makes his story uncomfortable and powerful at the same time. And even now, when we look back across 2 centuries, we can still feel the weight of his question hanging in the air. If freedom is declared sacred, who is it truly for? Until that question is answered honestly, the spirit of Denmark Vesey continues to challenge the conscience of history. As we continue to sit with the story of Denmark Vesey, we begin to understand that his life was not simply about rebellion. It was about imagination. In a city where slavery was treated as normal, he imagined something radically different. He imagined Charleston without chains. He imagined ships carrying families towards safety instead of transporting bodies into bondage. That kind of imagination is dangerous in an unjust system. It shakes foundations. Imagine the mental discipline required to hold such a vision while walking daily through a city built on slavery. Vesey saw auction blocks. He saw coffles of enslaved men and women march through streets. He heard the crack of whips. Yet inside his mind, another picture existed. A picture of freedom not limited to himself. That dual awareness takes strength. It requires refusing to let the visible world dictate what is possible. We must also consider the loneliness of leadership. Planning revolt meant carrying knowledge that could not be shared freely. Trust had to be earned carefully. Even those who agreed with him might hesitate when danger became real. Leaders in resistance movements often carry heavy isolation. They must appear calm while fear presses close. Vesey likely felt that weight in the weeks before discovery. When betrayal came, it did more than expose a plan. It revealed how fragile unity can be under oppression. Fear is powerful. The promise of reward or the threat of punishment can fracture trust. Vesey would have understood that risk from the beginning, yet he moved forward anyway. That willingness to proceed despite the possibility of betrayal speaks to conviction. After his execution, White Charleston tried to erase his influence by burying him without a marker, but erasure rarely succeeds fully. Stories travel in ways that stone and soil cannot contain. Enslaved communities would have spoken of him in whispers. Free black residents would have remembered him with guarded language. His name became part of oral tradition long before it was carved in monuments. Over time, his legacy transformed. In some eras, he was painted as villainous, in others as heroic. The shifting interpretations reflect changing national attitudes towards slavery and resistance. But beneath those interpretations lies a constant truth. He challenged the idea that slavery was permanent. He refused to accept that bondage was inevitable. His story also intersects with larger Atlantic history. The Haitian Revolution, the American Revolution, and global debates about human rights all form the background of his life. He was not isolated from world events. He read about them. He thought about them. He understood that change was happening elsewhere. That awareness fed his belief that change was possible in Charleston as well. There is something striking about the fact that he chose Haiti as a destination. Haiti represented black sovereignty. It represented a successful revolt. It represented hope that enslaved people could govern themselves. For Vesey and his co-conspirators, Haiti was more than a location. It was symbol of what could be achieved. If we imagine him in the final moments before execution, we might picture not only fear but also clarity. He would have known that even if he died, the system he opposed was unstable. He had already shaken it. The panic of authorities proved that his vision had power. Even unsuccessful revolt can reveal cracks in the foundation of oppression. Today, historians continue to analyze his trial records. They question testimony. They examine motivations. They debate scale. That scholarly work is important. But beyond analysis lies human reality. Vesey was a man who purchased his freedom and then refused to be satisfied with that limited victory. He believed that justice required collective liberation. His story forces us to examine moral complexity. Was violent revolt justified in a violent system? How do we measure responsibility in a world where law itself defends injustice? These are difficult questions. They resist simple answers. Vesey's life places those questions directly before us. It also reminds us that resistance movements are rarely neat. They involve risk, secrecy, faith, and fear. They are shaped by imperfect humans acting under extreme pressure. Denmark Vesey was not a mythic figure. He was flesh and blood. He worked with his hands. He worshipped with his community. He loved his family. And he made a choice that cost him his life. When Charleston eventually erected memorials in his honor, it marked a profound shift. The city that once silenced him now acknowledges him publicly. That transformation does not undo the past, but it shows how memory evolves. History is not static. It is revisited, reconsidered, reframed. Denmark Vesey's life remains a mirror. It reflects the tension between freedom proclaimed and freedom denied. It reflects the courage required to imagine systemic change. It reflects the cost of daring to act on that imagination. As we close this chapter on his story, we are left with a powerful image. A free black carpenter walking the streets of Charleston, carrying tools in his hands and revolution in his thoughts. A man who could have lived quietly, but chose instead to confront injustice at its roots. A leader who saw beyond his personal liberation and envisioned collective freedom. His plan did not unfold as he hoped. The uprising did not ignite. The ships did not sail. But the dream of liberation he carried did not vanish. It became part of a larger current that would eventually sweep across the nation. Denmark Vesey reminds us that freedom movements are built not only on success, but on daring attempts, on people who risk everything to challenge systems that seem immovable. His life stands as testimony that even in the shadow of gallows, the vision of justice can endure. As the decades passed after Denmark Vesey's execution, the memory of him moved like an underground current beneath Charleston's polished surface. The grand home still stood. The ship still docked. Cotton and rice still flowed through the port. But beneath that outward normalcy, fear lingered. Slaveholders knew that the idea of revolt had once grown strong enough to nearly erupt. That knowledge could not be undone. It is important to understand that Vesey's story unfolded in a city deeply dependent on slavery. Charleston was not merely a southern town with plantations nearby. It was a hub of the domestic slave trade. Human beings were bought and sold openly. Wealth was measured in land and enslaved labor. For Vesey to organize in such a place was not only dangerous, it was symbolic. He challenged slavery at one of its strongest centers. His execution did not stop resistance. Enslaved people across the South continued to run away. They sabotaged tools. They slowed their labor. They passed coded messages through song and prayer. Resistance takes many forms. Vesey's attempt was dramatic, but it was part of a larger pattern of refusal that defined enslaved life. In the years leading up to the Civil War, the memory of slave revolts haunted the South. Nat Turner's uprising in Virginia in 1831 intensified fear even further. The shadow of Denmark Vesey's plan made those later rebellions feel connected. White leaders tightened control repeatedly, but the tighter the grip, the clearer it became that slavery relied on force rather than consent. For black communities, Vesey's story carried both pride and pain. Pride that one of their own had dared to dream beyond limitation. Pain that the cost had been so severe. Families lost fathers and sons in the aftermath of the trials. Churches were dismantled. Spaces of gathering were disrupted. The price of even imagining freedom was heavy. When the Civil War finally erupted in 1861, the nation confronted the very issue Vesey had grappled with decades earlier. Could a republic built on liberty continue to defend slavery? The war answered that question through bloodshed. The 13th Amendment eventually abolished slavery in 1865. But long before that legal shift, Vesey had already declared in action that slavery was intolerable. There is something haunting about the fact that he did not live to see emancipation. He did not see black men enlist in Union armies. He did not see the chains formally broken. Yet his vision foreshadowed that breaking. He saw the injustice clearly when many still defended it publicly. He acted on that clarity. As history moved into the 20th century, interpretations of Vesey shifted again. Some minimized his influence. Others elevated him as a revolutionary hero. What remains constant is the fact that he refused silence. He refused to accept a narrow definition of freedom. Imagine again the tension in those secret meetings. The low candlelight, the careful exchange of words, the mixture of hope and dread. Those moments capture the human side of revolution. It is not grand speeches on open stages. It is quiet courage among trusted companions. It is decision made in shadows with awareness of consequence. Vesey's literacy and engagement with Scripture also remind us that resistance is often intellectual before it becomes physical. He read texts. He interpreted them through the lens of injustice. He formed a moral argument against slavery rooted in both faith and reason. That intellectual foundation shaped his plan. When we humanize him fully, we must see more than conspirator described in trial records. We must see the boy born in the Caribbean, the enslaved youth sold into labor, the man who won a lottery and purchased his freedom, the carpenter who built furniture in Charleston, the church member who sang hymns, the father who watched his children remain enslaved. All of these layers shaped the man who later organized Revolt. His life also challenges the idea that free black people in the early republic were passive beneficiaries of limited rights. Vesey demonstrates that free black communities were politically conscious. They debated strategy. They discussed global revolutions. They understood power dynamics. They were not waiting quietly for change. They were considering how to force it. Today, when visitors walk through Charleston and encounter memorials bearing his name, they step into a conversation that spans centuries. The city once feared him. Now it acknowledges him. That transformation reveals how societies evolve in their understanding of justice. Yet his story still provokes discomfort. Some struggle with the idea of violent uprising. Others argue that violence was inherent in slavery itself. The moral tension remains. Perhaps that tension is part of his enduring relevance. He forces us to confront the cost of injustice and the cost of challenging it. Denmark Vesey's life stands as testament to the power of vision under oppression. He saw beyond his own purchased freedom. He imagined collective liberation. He risked everything for that vision. Though the revolt was stopped, the desire for freedom it represented did not die. And so his story remains, echoing through Charleston streets and beyond. A reminder that even in cities built on bondage, there were minds daring to dream of chains broken. A reminder that freedom movements are often born in quiet meetings long before they become public history. A reminder that courage sometimes means standing against an entire system, even when the outcome is uncertain. Denmark Vesey's life was cut short, But the questions he raised continue to challenge us. What does justice demand? What is the price of silence? And when faced with deep injustice, what are we willing to risk for the possibility of a different world? Even as Charleston moved forward after the Civil War, rebuilding itself from the ruins of conflict, the shadow of Denmark Vesey remained woven into its history. The chains had been legally broken in 1865, but freedom did not immediately mean equality. New systems of control emerged. Black citizens faced violence, intimidation, and political exclusion. In many ways, the questions Vesey wrestled with in the early 19th century still lingered. What does freedom truly look like? Who protects it? Who defines it? During Reconstruction, black men briefly held political office across the South. Churches reopened. Schools were built. Communities organized openly in ways that had once been criminalized. For a moment, the collective freedom Vesey imagined seemed closer than ever, but backlash followed. Segregation laws hardened. White supremacist violence spread. The promise of equality was pushed back again. Through these cycles of hope and repression, Vesey's story served as a quiet reminder that resistance had deep roots. Black Charlestonians knew that long before the Civil War, one of their own had dared to imagine full liberation. That memory strengthened resolve. It connected generations across time. In the 20th century, as the civil rights movement emerged, activists looked back at earlier figures who challenged injustice. Though not always widely discussed in mainstream narratives, Denmark Vesey stood as part of a long tradition of resistance. His willingness to confront slavery directly foreshadowed later struggles against segregation and discrimination. Different eras, different strategies, but the same hunger for dignity. When a memorial honoring him was finally erected in Charleston in the 21st century, it marked more than historical recognition. It marked a shift in moral perspective. A city that once executed him now publicly acknowledged him as a figure of resistance. That shift did not erase the pain of his execution, but it showed that history can be revisited with new understanding. Still, his legacy remains complex. Some continue to debate the scope of his planned revolt. Others question the fairness of the trial records. But perhaps the deeper truth lies not in the exact number of participants, but in the courage required to attempt what he attempted. Organizing even a small uprising in a city like Charleston carried enormous risk. The mere possibility of mass coordination was revolutionary. When we step back and consider his entire life, we see a journey shaped by transformation. Born into slavery in the Caribbean, sold and transported, laboring in bondage, winning a lottery that changed his legal status, building a trade, joining a church, reading scripture, observing injustice daily, and finally, choosing to risk everything for collective freedom. Each stage built toward the next. None of it was random. He was not driven by sudden anger alone. His plan matured over time. He studied the environment. He assessed numbers. He considered escape routes. He thought about ships and timing. That methodical thinking reveals depth. He was not reckless. He was intentional. It is also important to imagine the emotional tension he must have carried. Walking through Charleston, knowing that suspicion could arise at any moment. Speaking to trusted allies while guarding against betrayal. Living between ordinary daily work and extraordinary secret planning. That double life required mental strength. His story reminds us that freedom movements are rarely neat or universally praised in their own time. Often, those who challenge injustice are condemned before they are understood. Vesey was labeled criminal by the system he opposed. Only later did broader perspectives begin to see him as part of a larger struggle for human rights. As we reflect on his legacy today, we are invited to hold complexity without losing empathy. Denmark Vesey did not live in a world of easy choices. He lived in a world where law protected injustice, where violence was routine, where silence meant complicity in suffering. In that world, he chose action. And perhaps the most enduring part of his story is not the failed uprising itself, but the courage to imagine it. Imagination is powerful. It precedes change. Before systems fall, someone must envision their end. Vesey envisioned a Charleston transformed. Even though he did not live to see chains broken, his vision joined a larger current that would eventually reshape the nation. Today, When we speak his name, we acknowledge a man who refused to be satisfied with personal comfort while others suffered. We acknowledge a leader who believed faith and freedom were intertwined. We acknowledge the cost of daring to challenge entrenched power. Denmark Vesey's life closes with execution, but his story does not end there. It continues wherever people question injustice. It continues wherever individuals weigh personal safety against collective liberation. It continues in every conversation about what freedom truly demands. And so, from the streets of Charleston to the pages of history, his legacy stands as both warning and inspiration. A warning that injustice breeds resistance. An inspiration that even in the most controlled environments, there are minds quietly preparing for change.